Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Johan Berger, and I'm the Business Development Manager for Executive Education at the College of Business and Economics here at the UAE University. As such, it's my privilege to welcome you all to this session of our second STEPS Forum, whereas STEPS, as you would see, is the acronym for Seminars and Talks on Executive Education and Postgraduate Studies. Today, we're talking about a very interesting topic, the competitiveness of Africa's economies. Why Africa? The reasoning behind that is simple. The UAE is one of the largest foreign direct investors in Africa and is constantly looking towards investing on this continent, which provides many investment opportunities for those countries and for those companies willing to mitigate and deal with the risk that the continent presents. Now, today we're going to deal with this topic, and I'm going to have Professor Sasidaran Gopalan to talk to us about the concept of competitiveness and how Africa relates to in general, and looking at one or two of the indices that are available. And to understand more, what do we talk about and what do we understand when we talk about competitiveness? I will thereafter ask Mr. Naveen Nahata from Tolaram, which is an investment group, or rather a large corporate from Singapore, to explain to us their move into and entry into Africa, more specifically into Nigeria, amongst others. He will be followed by Ms. Shumay Lam, who is from Singapore, an entrepreneur who has ventured into Rwanda, and we would hear from her why and how they went about to establish Poultry East Africa Limited in Rwanda. Thereafter, we'll have a few minutes, about 20 minutes available for a Q&A. You have the chat function, and I would appreciate it if you could raise the questions that you would have via this chat function, so that we can then address those topics that you have any questions on. So I think without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Sasidaran Gopalan to talk to us about what is competitiveness. Now, Professor Sasi is an assistant professor here at the UAEU, at the College of Business and Economics. He has his PhD from George Mason University, and he had teaching stints at universities in the East, including at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, the National University of Singapore, and then also the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong itself. In his previous stint before he arrived here at the UAEU, Dr. Sasi was involved with the Center for Emerging Market Studies, where he played a huge role in refining and updating the index of competitiveness for emerging market countries. So someone that's an expert in the field of competitiveness. So without further ado, Dr. Sasi, over to you. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Johan. I hope you can hear me. Good morning, everyone, and nice to see my fellow panelists here, who I'm really eagerly looking forward to learn something more from them about what it feels like to doing business in Africa. Well, I should start with a very simple caveat. I am really not the resident expert in the region in Africa. I have done some academic work and policy work on competitiveness, so I'm going to talk to you all in that capacity. I'm hopefully trying to set the context, the scene, in terms of how we understand competitiveness. Well, I can give you the punchline right away. You don't have to wait until 20, 25 minutes. Nobody really understands what competitiveness means. I mean, if I can put it brutally, it's just that there is a lot of dimensions that this issue of competitiveness carries with it. It is very hard to pinpoint just one and say this is exactly what we need for this country to do better, right? So as someone who has worked in developing indices and indexes, and it becomes, you start playing this game, you realize that there are how these rankings start going up when you adjust some parameters here, when the rankings start coming down. So the whole idea here for me is to give you an my perspective on what I think competitiveness looks like and how we measure it based on the popular go-to indices. And then the field experts who are actually doing businesses can confirm and attest to whether any of this makes any sense. Did they consider any of this before really putting their money into this country? I mean, that's actually what ultimately matters from a policy perspective, right? From an academic perspective, you can look at it and say that this country is doing great when it comes to these indicators, but then does it really matter at the de facto level, right? Not just at the de jure level. So that's something I'm really curious to learn as well from those who are doing business, and we'll be hearing from them very soon. So without further ado, let me, all right, sorry, let me just make sure I can move. I think something is going on. Okay, there you go. You can see my slides, right? Okay, so if I should start a narrative of competitiveness, the picture that comes to my mind is about how we use and understand the word globalization. It seems like everybody talks about globalization, but then nobody really has a particular idea of like what really it means. I mean, it's become such a used or a misused or even abused, if you will, term in politics and economics and across fields and disciplines, right? And if you think about the idea of globalization, to some, ideology matters. To some, it is about religion. To some, it is about economics. To some, it is about culture. To some, it is about politics. For some, it is about the environment, right? It's a multi-dimensional concept, and competitiveness fits right there it has the same pattern. It really is not. You cannot pin it down to just one idea or one construct, because it has got a multiple set of issues going on with competitiveness. So it is important to keep that overarching idea at the back of your mind, that we are really not narrowing it down to just one idea or one little dimension. It's a lot, and that's exactly where the problem comes. And how do you capture when there is so much going on, right? I mean, there have been admirable efforts over the last few decades where people have tried to throw some light on how to make sense of these different dimensions, which we will see. I will present to you in a minute, but the bottom line still remains that it is you need to keep that it is a multidimensional idea, right? Now, if you go back to the origins of the discussion of competitiveness, even 25 years ago, one of my favorite economists to this date, Paul Krugman, who also won the Nobel Prize, incidentally, for different reasons, wrote this very powerful piece in the Foreign Affairs talking about how competitiveness can be a dangerous obsession. And he was making a very simple point. Let's not compare how nations compete based on how firms compete, right? So firms can die, but nations do not really die, right? They are not the same. I mean, they may run out of business. They need to really stick to their bottom line, and they need to actually compete, and they have to be competitive to survive in the market. But then that does not really apply to a country as a whole, and it is misleading and dangerous to start obsessing over it as the be all and end all of why policy exists or what economic policy should do. Now, the reason why I start the presentation with this sort of cynical attitude is point is that he was very profound. 25 years ago, he predicted, economists don't do very well with predictions, as you all know, but he said that if this continues, probably the world might be heading towards a trade war at some point. Well, 2020, 2019, 2018, the not too distant past, we had a famous trade tiff between the US and China, partly because driven by such obsessions about how or what the misplaced notion of competitiveness looks like in today's world. Is it all about just getting a trade surplus? It is just about having an external imbalance. I need to export more than I import. Well, if I don't, then there is a problem, right? So there are, this was 25 years back, and I don't think he had this in mind, and he never anticipated that perhaps, but then this is what we see. So it is useful to keep that in mind, that when we are talking about competitiveness, people have looked at it. Serious academics have tried their best to try to wrap their head around how we can refine this notion. And it is incredibly frustrating for someone working in this field, because you really do not have a good grasp yet, because every time you look at the data, something springs up, and that becomes surprising. So for those who are in the field, it might just be a joke. I mean, why do you care about these things? Maybe it doesn't matter to me. And that's exactly what I'm trying to get to here. I'm trying to bring in all the dimensions that I feel have to be discussed, and probably we will have to acknowledge that all these are important, and then we let them tell us more about whether these matter or not. Okay, right. Now, from an academic standpoint, apart from, I mean, if you look at the general without getting too boring or lecturing about what competitiveness looks like, two broad views exist, right? So the most predominant view today that we all seem to subconsciously accept is about that the notion of productivity. The competitiveness is mostly about productivity, about the location, taking after the famous Michael Porter and his pioneering work. And since then, there's been a lot of work at the firm level about how a location is defined as the productivity. As how firms who are located in that particular region or country, and how can they, what they can achieve. And that's the notion that we want to focus on. Well, you also have the market share cost view, which is equally important, but it is not, it is in economics terms, we can say that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? I mean, you do care about labor costs, you do care about unit labor costs, and you do want to have a relative upper hand when it comes to how you handle it as part of your country. But then it doesn't have to be the only thing in mind. And this is actually where your doing business idea comes into play. And I will show you that in a minute. But so these two views have been wrestling and people with each other in terms of what matters more. But this is like to just give you a perspective on how we understand competitiveness. This is the productivity view seems to have taken hold, and most of us invariably agree that ultimately what matters is prosperity for everyone. Ultimately, productivity of the country matters, and we're going to reach that, and that is what competitiveness should reflect. Right now, practically, what does it mean? I mean, from a policy angle, as a policymaker, if I'm a businessman, I'm trying to invest in these countries. If I'm looking at the idea of competitiveness, so what am I supposed to be, where am I supposed to go look for in terms of metrics? If I just have the money, I have no idea, I'm going to look for some indications about what is going on in the country. Where do I go to, right? Well, then you have these cross-country global measures that talk about how competitiveness can be analyzed, and two of them which were very, very popular, almost everyone uses it as a reference point, which is definitely useful, but there are criticisms, which is the Global Competitiveness Index from the World Economic Forum, which takes a very distinctly productivity-based view on how competitiveness is measured. And then you have the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking. Not many people talk about that, but it's also equally up there, important. Partly also, as I will show you, the issue is more about, it has a lot more survey information, data, perceptions-based issues that are captured there. But in the Global Competitiveness Index, you have a fair share of them as well, but then it is at least available. You can use a lot more hard indicators. And then you have the applications of cost-based measures. Before this recent controversy about the World Bank doing business, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which I'm not going to get into right now, but it is still, the ease of doing business was looked at by many policymakers as a very useful benchmark metric to understand how administrative costs can be a hindrance for doing business. And I think that is one of the notions of how competitiveness functions. But it is not the only thing that matters, right? As we would see. But there's a very close correspondence between the two, right? So now, just give you a very broad overview of what these indices do. I mean, it looks a bit complicated. Of course, it is directly from those reports. Now, they define it as the set of institutions, policies, factors that determine the level of productivity of a country. Now, if we may ask, what exactly goes into these different pillars? And they have like 12 pillars, over 100 different indicators. 100. I mean, imagine, you're talking about institutions, you're looking at property rights, you're looking at the trust issues, you're looking at government regulations, what else? Business costs. You're talking about ethical behavior of firms. Are investors' interests protected? So these are all giving you a sense of what institutions cover. Now, what about the infrastructure? It's obvious, right? Infrastructure, we are talking about the ports, the railways, the airlines, electricity, all mobile telephones, all of this matters. Then you have the macro environment. You cannot ignore the broader macroeconomic picture when you're talking about competitiveness. And so how deeply you are in debt at the macro level, how responsible fiscally is your government, or what's the inflationary costs of the country, to what extent savings investment behavior of the particular country. Again, all these are captured under macro environment. Then you have the human capital issues, health and education. And remember, I mean, we all look at it in isolation, but then if you can see the way it is being defined, all of this has some role to play in the way they affect the competitiveness of a country. Even though that concept as a whole is still a bit elusive, and we still don't, at the firm level, it might be fairly well defined for the company level. But then for the country level, when you're aggregating it, you can't just put all the firms together and say this is exactly the same applicable to the country. So it is still a bit of an elusive concept. And but having said that, you can still glean some useful insights from looking at these indicators. And so it's important to keep that at the back of your mind, that there are various, these are some of the dimensions that matter. Then we talk about financial market development, technological readiness, financial inclusion. You know, do you have an access to bank account? Do you have ATMs? Do you have, you know, that's part of your sustainable development goals, if you will, and how it can lead to overall prosperity. So all of this are examples of how they come together. They give you an indication at different levels as to how each of the countries are doing. Now, seems like a lot of work, but this is fairly established techniques available to make sense of this many number of variables and these many. You look at the correlations between these different variables. Can you let the algorithm do the job for you, or are you going to be asking some of the experts about what matters? So these are all choices that will determine the outcome being the index and the rankings. So you have to keep that at the back of your mind when you are looking at any index per se. But this is what the most popular index today that we all have we go to for understanding competitiveness talks about, right? So then if you look at the IMD in contrast, well, I mean, they don't have a neater definition like what we saw with the World Economic Forum, but they say that it cannot be reduced just to the idea of GDP and productivity, because enterprises, firms have to cope with cultural, political, social dimensions, which is also true, right? I mean, as a person who's invested in Africa, maybe I can turn to my panelists for this, for more insights on this. These things would matter. It's not just about GDP or productivity. You really want to understand the other dimensions as well, which we cannot ignore. So that also has to be captured in some form. But then the question then remains, how do you what is the metric with which you would measure some cultural variables, or you're talking about ethical issues or political values? How are you going to get that? I mean, so this is where your perceptions become important, right? So you conduct large scale surveys with different people, different subject matter experts, and then try and make sense of that data. So as you can see in the breakdown in front of you in the screen, you have hard statistics, and then you have the survey data, and then you have some background data, right? And then the survey data is obviously not transparent, not available to you. You don't know whether it is given to you. You can also ask through expert interviews, and you can come up with rankings. So this is how the business of rankings run in many indices in whichever field you're looking into. But this is the most popular way of doing it, is to combine hard statistics that is compiled by multilateral agencies available to everyone, and then you complement that with some kind of survey or perception-based measures, right? So now, having given you a very broad overview, I'm going to get into some specifics without losing track of time, just to show you how these numbers can be used. Okay, again, like I said, some usual suspects, right? We can always understand Mauritius or Botswana. They are all success stories. South Africa, of course, in the African region, they're all for everybody to. People are, can acknowledge, but given that we have someone who's working, who's doing business in Rwanda and Nigeria, you see Rwanda has shows up as one of the significant better performers in the African region in the last few years. My own research, which I'll show you a little bit, it seems to suggest that there's been massive improvements in the way they have attended to some of the minutest details that matter for companies to do businesses and to improve their competitiveness profile in general. So I think if you look at the global competitiveness score and then you compare it with the other best performing and worst performing countries, you get a sense of there are still large gaps between these different countries in the region. And so the region obviously is not homogeneous. It is very, very heterogeneous. And that is also one of the criticisms of these kind of indices, which I'll come to. Even within the country, you have large countries where there is significant variation. So does it even make sense to talk about one competitiveness index or score for a country like South Africa? right? Within Johan might be able to tell us more about it, but you have so many different regions within South Africa, which may be developing in different ways, and they have different policies, and maybe the provincial level analysis becomes very important here. And this is one of my pet peeves in my previous life. Before I moved here, I was working on subnational indices about large countries, emerging markets, especially China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. You see that provinces have very different flavors, and they are not the same at all. And there is a good reason why they have become what they have become. And so you are looking at competitiveness, you need to be able to go one level down from the aggregate to the subnational level, at least to throw some insights. So I will show you some more data on that. So you can come up with this. I'm going to sprinkle this data. I'm not going to get into details of the discussion, but the obvious points come about, which is countries like Mauritius, South Africa. Of course, Mauritius is still a high income country, but if you look at only the emerging markets, then obviously Botswana, South Africa fit the bill. Then you have other countries like Rwanda, which are actually lower income countries. You see that they have done very well, but then clearly there are other countries like Malawi or Sierra Leone, which is still trying to catch up. And you have the fragile countries, the Horn of Africa, and many other countries which are in that region, which need to do better, which seriously have some issues that they need to fix. Now, I'm going to move on very quickly. I'm going to make a very a comparison point here. Now, how important is doing business, and does it really matter for competitiveness as such? Well, if you look at the simple scatter plot that you see in front of you, which is basically comparing the doing business score and the competitiveness index score, right? It's not explicitly part of the other index, so you can really make sense. They're just correlations, right? So you are saying that the countries which not so surprisingly, are doing very well with respect to doing business, classified by the World Bank as a set of de jure regulations. Have they accounted for those things? And actually, what you see in the competitiveness index, there seem to be a very close match. I mean, not a perfect correlation, but they are at least there is a very strong movement in these two indicators at the same time. Now, that tells you that it is, and the cost versus productivity is not to be pitted against each one against the other. It's more like one being part of the other. And so it is important to pay attention to both these dimensions at the same time. And that is what you get. Now, if you look at this table, this I pulled out from the 2019 rankings for sub-Saharan Africa, and then on the right, and then you have the doing business on the left. You see they're very comparable countries, right? Those which rank very high, not at the global level, of course, the numbers are not looking very favorable, but within the region, these are the top 10, right? And then if you look at it, you see Rwanda ranks very highly in doing business, slightly lower in competitiveness, but at least within the top 10, you have pretty similar classifications, okay? You see that for Botswana, you see that for Mauritius, so there is an overlap between these two rankings, and they are actually not measuring the same thing at all, because the doing business, before it was scrapped, you look at the details, there is about administrative regulations and how onerous this is for some firm to go. Do they get information about these things? And there's a lot of other details that are captured that are not reflected in competitiveness, and vice versa, right? So there is a sense of comparability, but of course they are not one and the same. That's why they are two distinct indices. But my own research understanding, take away from this, looking at this literature discussion, is that all these dimensions that you see in front of you matter, right? I worked on this for the Emerging Market Center earlier before coming here, and we tried to come up with a framework about how we can classify emerging markets, and competitiveness was a very integral notion that played a role. And if you look at theoretically, what are the issues that matter, and can we find data for that? Yeah, well, from the discussion, we can already say macroeconomic environment matters. Infrastructure would rank very highly at the top of your mind. Financial sector development matters. Bank credit access, financial inclusion issues, and then institutional quality, of course. Will my money be safe if I put in there? Will the government be responsible? Will investors be protected? Those questions are important. And then you have your development profile, what natural resources those countries have, and is there anything that they can bring to the table? And of course, their external orientation. Are they closed? open, to what extent they depend on aid flows for their survival, or what kind of capital flows go into the countries, and how shaky the fundamentals are. So these are some of the dimensions that matter. And if you look at some of my own calculations about a global perspective across regions, again, Rwanda shows up very prominently. And I keep highlighting Rwanda because I know that the next panelist will be talking about Rwanda and 4S, and so I thought should at least highlight that about what that the promising pathway, the trajectory that some of these countries show. And in the sub-Saharan African region, again, Botswana, these are very consistent rankings if you look at it, right? So what I have come up with in my own research versus what the World Economic Forum shows, there is a bit of an overlap in terms of the countries that come out. And if you classify them under various income groupings, you will still see that they make sense. So broadly, the suspicions are right? So this is what you see. Now, we'll skip. Now, one couple of points, and then I'll probably leave the rest of them to talk about this. Two important points, actually. One, my famous former boss used to tell me, competitiveness rankings are not like a beauty contest. They don't serve an end in itself. Like, you need to use that to do something better, right? So you are essentially trying to engage in some kind of a policy simulation exercise to understand and focus on the weakest sort of indicators. If you have hundreds of indicators, then choose like the bottom 20, and then there are computing techniques available, right? I mean, you have a far more sophisticated land today we are living in when it comes to statistics and econometrics, and we can figure out how best to address those criticisms. But the simplest intuitive way to think about is look at those very badly performing indicators and pick those for those countries. Simulate them to like the average, if they're below average, and say, bring them to the average, assuming that everyone else is also running at the same time trying to improve. Now, what happens? And how do they actually move up the ladder? Are they doing that? So an idea, this is not part of the World Economic Forum rankings, but this is an idea for anyone who's interested in this field. They should be trying to come up with something meaningful, interesting. They can use the data to suggest some practical considerations, policy suggestions that would help the countries climb up the ladder, right? And this is also a useful tool, a KPI for policymakers when they see that if you do this, you will become, you go up the rankings. Of course, with all the caveats about the methodology that you're using and the pitfalls you have to keep in mind, it is important to have this extension as part of your analysis, which will be useful for even people doing business. I mean, they can understand that these are the indicators that they have worked on and that have allowed them to climb up the rankings, right? Now, 2 points on criticisms to set the ball rolling in terms of conversation and get you thinking in that direction. Some of the conceptual difficulties which have not been resolved. I don't claim that I've resolved any of this or I am going to here, but I'm just throwing it out there for you to think when you're looking at these indices. Take them not with a pinch of salt, with a bucket of salt, right? Now, is competitiveness a determinant of prosperity, or is it actually captured through prosperity? So this is an endemic issue. It's plaguing this literature, and it is not. There's no easy answer. How are you going to, capture that, right? I mean, if you throw in a variable like GDP and then use that to understand whether the country is doing well or not, is different from saying that all these things, if you take care, then your GDP will be higher, right? So you have to wrestle with such questions before looking at these indicators, right? And it matters if you're looking at it from the point of view of benchmarking before taking decisions, business decisions. My bigger concern, more than that philosophical concern, is about your aggregate. How useful is an aggregate measure compared to a provincial measure or a regional measure? It may not be easy. It may not be easy to compile the data at that level. It may not be easy to do this analysis at a comparable level for all the regions, but it is relevant, isn't it? I mean, for large emerging markets and developing economies, I mean, I'm familiar with, at least from the East Asian side, China, India, or Indonesia, you have massive disparities when it even in the African region. South Africa, I think Johan might be able to give a lecture on that. On Algeria, how about Kenya? I mean, there are different provincial the regularities that you see, which are very different. Sorry, one second. There you go. This is from an academic study that's talking about how you have so much the disparities within provinces in Kenya, about wide variations in access to education between provinces, about different access to basic health services. I mean, all of these indicators we talked about that put together matter for your competitiveness as such, it becomes important, right? So I am running out of time, so I'm going to stop in one more slide and I'm done. So basically, should keep this in mind. I hope it was useful to get this conversation started. Any index construction per se should also address issues about how do you construct the index in terms of weighting the different indicators. Like, who decides? What's the scientific basis of having 5 different dimensions and say one takes 10% or everything should be given equal weightage? Something to keep in mind. And we should all, as academics, we strive for transparency and replicability. If I can create this index and give you the data, you should be able to arrive at the same answer. So those are things to keep in mind, not just to competitiveness, but applicable to all other indices as well. All right, thank you for this opportunity. Thanks, Johan. I hope it was at least somewhat useful to get the conversation started. And I look forward to hearing from other panelists. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Sasi. Really appreciate it. If I can just, yes, you've already removed your presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you for setting the scene. And I'm sure that Naveen and Shumay will be able to fit their talk in within that. So I think without further ado, I'm going to ask Mr. Naveen Nahata to put his presentation on. And while he's doing that, I'm going to just give you a short feedback about him. Naveen is the Managing Director for FinTech and Infrastructure at Tolaram, where he also has the regulatory role of President Commissioner for Bank Amar, which is owned by Tolaram in Indonesia. He's been at the helm of the infrastructure business since 2016 and drove mega projects such as the construction of the Lekki port in Lagos, Nigeria. This port was named the African Infrastructure Deal of the Year in 2019. He's also involved with the development of the Lagos Free Zone, which is Nigeria's first privately owned special economic zone. He transitioned into his current role as MD from being the former CFO, and he's been part of the senior management team for 17 years, responsible for setting the strategic direction of the business. So without further ado, Naveen, over to you. We look forward to your talk. You sound as if you're muted.
Am I audible now?
You're on.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Johan. And first of all, good morning to everyone. Good afternoon to Shumay, since he's in the same part of the world as I am. And first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Shashi for an illuminating presentation around competitiveness and ease of doing business. And I must say that when we look to go into new markets, we don't necessarily look at some of these things. We have our own matrix and our own ways to assess the attractiveness of a particular market. But part of what he was talking about is something which is endemic to the development of the free zone, which we are doing in Lagos. Essentially, we have a quasi-government role of developing a free zone and attracting foreign investment in the country. And that is where what he's talked about is something which we use extensively, especially the ease of doing business. And maybe I'll talk about that as I go through this small presentation on Tolaram Group. So my objective today is to share with you the history of Tolaram Group and its evolution and where it is today. And hopefully in the context of that, then we can talk about competitiveness, especially for African continent. So on that note, let me start. So we are a Singapore-based enterprise building businesses that propel growth and elevate communities. So that's essentially what we do as a group. Most of our businesses are in emerging markets, i.e. Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and South Asia. The origins of the group were in Indonesia. About 70 years back, we started as a small retail shop in Malang, Indonesia, and since then we have grown into now 4 different continents. The gentleman at the center of the picture is the founder of the group, who's the father of our current chairman. I've already mentioned that we are in 4 different continents. Our biggest presence is in Africa, but we are growing in other parts of the world. Recently, we acquired a stake in a Brazilian company. We are already in Indonesia and in India and Singapore, in Asia. Estonia is another market where we've been since 1996. We export close to about 100 countries, reaching close to about 1 billion people through our products. So we have three main business verticals: the consumer goods, infrastructure and industrial, and consumer financial services. And consumer goods is by far our biggest business vertical as of today. We are the largest consumer goods company in Africa, with leading consumer brands in noodles, pasta, cooking oil, dairy, cereal, snacks, beverages, oral care. And while looking at this portfolio, we are also constantly looking at the future of foods, where we are experimenting with plant-based protein through some recent investments and market development activity. And I'll talk more about each of these verticals in the subsequent slides. So just to briefly touch on the infrastructure side, Johan has already mentioned, we are developing a deep sea port integrated within a fully privately owned free zone. And with these two mega projects, we are hoping to change the landscape of maritime logistics in Nigeria. Apart from this, on the industrial side, we own a pulp and paper mill in Estonia, which is exporting sustainable packaging to more than 70 countries. And lastly, consumer financial services. This is one of our latest verticals. We actually have the first fully digital bank in Indonesia, with award-winning microloans platform and a fast-growing savings app. We, on the back of the success we've achieved in Indonesia, ventured now into Brazil, looking to go into Nigeria, as well as starting a P2P platform in Estonia. So these are some of the experiments which the group is doing in the consumer financial services world. In terms of our vision and mission, we create sustainable value for all our stakeholders by being market leader in the spheres we operate. So that's a simple philosophy with which we look at our business. And purpose is what really defines us, which is creating possibilities for generation. And the way I will expand or elaborate on this is that essentially our history and experience in navigating different and diverse markets allow us to continuously grow by creating new possibilities. And we keep looking for opportunities to grow businesses. Sometimes we go into a completely unrelated business field with a view to experiment and find new possibilities. For generations, because this is a family-owned group, today the fourth generation is already working within the organization, although it's a fully professionalized group. So family members participate, but they don't necessarily lead the businesses. The business leadership is with people who have shown the mettle and has a proven track record. And that is probably where this particular group differs from a lot of family-owned businesses in emerging markets. So now in this phase, I'm going to talk more about our African journey. And to just read the quote from our chairman, who's essentially credited with taking us to Africa. We ventured into Africa in 1977 with the help of a friend whose family had already been doing business in Nigeria since 1880. And at that time, Nigeria had a population of 85 million and a per capita income that was 4 times higher than Indonesia. So actually, Nigeria was a very attractive market for us, especially coming from Indonesia. Of course, now we know the history and things have played out very differently, but we have nothing to complain because Nigeria has been an extremely profitable market for the group. So in this slide, essentially, I'll capture our evolution and our journey in one sense. We first went into Nigeria by in the business of importing and trading goods. Essentially, we would import, finished products and sell it to the Nigerian population. It was a big market, and that is what we were tapping in. And while we were doing business there, the country faced certain economic hardships, which created difficulties for business operators like ours. So Nigeria had a promissory note crisis in 84, 85. Essentially, government banned remittances of all your foreign exchanges. And in return for that, they issued promissory note. This was a major blow to our existing trading business because, as you can understand, if the flow of funds gets stuck, then your trading business is practically dead. But out of it, came the idea of setting up manufacturing businesses in Nigeria. And that's when in 1986, 87, we set up our first manufacturing plant in Nigeria in the textile space. We continued developing the manufacturing skills within the country, but at the same time also once normalcy returned, went back to importation of goods and trading. We eventually started importing Indomie, or the noodles, the instant noodles from Indonesia. And just on the basis of those, we started creating a distribution network, which then propelled us into setting up a manufacturing facility for noodle manufacturing in 1996. And that's when our first factory came up in Ota near Lagos. That evolved into a business where there was a need felt by the family to bring in professionals who could bring in the necessary expertise to market and manufacture these products professionally and in the right way, eventually leading to the explosion of this particular business in Nigeria for us. Today, Indomie is one of the leading brands in the country, and it is one of the most successful business. We have about 23 factories which are we are operating within the African space, out of which 19 are in Nigeria, and we employ close to about 16,000 people. And on the back of this, we have been now able to launch a wave of new consumer branded products, which I'll show it to you in the next slide. So while we launched Indomie in 1995, started manufacturing and marketing the product, it was not until 2011 that we started looking at expanding our capability into new areas of consumer products. And since 2011, almost every year, we have been launching new products, either products which have been developed indigenously by us in Nigeria, or products which have been brought into the country in partnership with some of the joint ventures which we have created. But essentially where still we are relying on the expertise on the ground in terms of manufacturing and marketing these products. We don't work on the philosophy of importing products and selling them in Nigeria. We essentially look to set up factories. We look to set up our capabilities on ground, and that is how we build businesses. That is how we build brands. And it's an eclectic range of products, starting from toilet cleaners to snacks like Pringles, cereals, Kellogg's, oral care products in partnership with Colgate, Huggies and Kotex, which are hygiene products in partnership with Kimberly-Clark. So this is the kind of product range that we have been able to create in the last decade or so. And on back of what we have been able to do in Nigeria, we then started looking to go into other parts of Africa. And here, I mean, we didn't look at competitive index. We essentially looked at the market potential. And that is what has taken us to markets like South Africa, Egypt, Ghana. And these are markets where we now have set up manufacturing facilities, where we have launched new brands and building the capability on ground to market and distribute these products. On this slide, I'll just give you a sense of how we go about our distribution very quickly, because this is one of our biggest strengths in our consumer products business, which is that ability to take the product to the consumer. We work on the principle of AAA, which is affordability, availability, and acceptability, where affordability and acceptability is driven by marketing, and manufacturing, it's the availability, which is what really we work on, and which is what is unique to how we do our business, because that's what differentiates us from the others in the market. Usually it's a complement of logistics capabilities with a lot of vehicles, network of distributors and sub-distributors reaching up to the retailer, and then finally going to the consumer. And what we do with our distributor and sub-distributor is not just give them the products and even the capability in terms of supporting them with distribution vehicles, but also taking a very active interest in how they manage their business. Actively helping them to redistribute is something which is what gives us our success. Moving on, infrastructure, a completely different story. Again, out of serendipity, we ended up working on Lekki Port project, a very ambitious project, because when we first started looking at this project, the cost of the project at 1.5 billion was almost 3 times the revenue of the group at that point in time. And on top of it, Nigerian had no experience of doing a public-private partnership project in infrastructure space. And we had no internal capability when we first started, but this started due to a discussion between the then president of the country and our chairman, and we just went into it. And for 12 years, we persevered, and we had many challenges, near-death experience for this particular project, but finally in 2020, we managed to achieve financial close. As I speak to you, almost 70% of the project is completed. It is slated to go commercially open in 2023 first quarter. This is going to be a transformational project for Nigeria in the maritime logistics space, simply because what it does is it doubles the capacity of all the existing port capacity in the country, and in the first phase, and then triples it in the second phase. And in and around the Lekki port, we have 800-hectare Lagos free zone development. And this is where I think what Dr. Sashi was talking about, meets us. And within the Lagos free zone, while we bring in our 40 years of experience of doing business in Nigeria and host of other incentives which are common to all the free zones in Nigeria, but what we really focus on is improving the ease of doing business. Nigeria today has an ease of doing business of about 130 odd, one of the lowest in the world. And we measure ourselves within the free zone in terms of this particular index. And we feel that, what we have done in the free zone changes that to something which is below 50. And that is where we are changing the game for businesses which are looking to go into Nigeria. And that is what is so unique about the Lagos free zone. This brings me to the third verticals of the zone, which of the group, which is the fintech or the consumer financial services. We started with Bank Amar. This is Indonesia's first and only pure play neobank serving Indonesian retail and MSME customers. With digital lending brand Tunaiku and digital branding banking brand Senyumku. It is actually Tunaiku which is the mainstay of our business, where what we do differently from all the other traditional banks is crunch big data to do credit scoring for our retail customer. And what we do is we offer micro loans to our consumers, which are primarily used for life-related events like healthcare issues or home improvement or education. And this is today a bank which is listed on the Indonesian Stock Exchange, and it has served close to about 500,000 customers with almost 6.5 million applications received till date. So this is one of the leading brands in fintech business in Indonesia today. And on the back of what we've learned in this business, we have now invested in credit lending business in Brazil, which is called Click Cash. And we've also invested in a company called Income, which is essentially a P2P loans platform. It is an adjunct to our credit lending business because being part of Income allows us to essentially sell and parcel our credit products or assets to other lenders who are looking to get an exposure in Indonesian market. We are also at the same time looking to go into Nigeria, Philippines, Colombia, and certain markets in Eastern Europe on the back of what we have achieved in Bank Amar. So this brings me to the penultimate slide, which is, what is the secret of our success? Well, I would say these are the 5 or 6 points which I would put as a takeaway from our story. First, it's our ability to take risk, venturing where others did not. Second, being entrepreneurial, adaptable, and flexible. I shared with you the story about the promissory note crisis in Nigeria, and that is a very good example of how we pivoted into manufacturing. Taking a very long-term view, in most of our business, especially in Africa, we realized very early that you need to have full control over your destiny, and hence forward and backward integration is an important component of success in African context. And then deep understanding of consumer needs and meeting them is another important business virtue, especially if you are in the consumer goods business. We do a lot of market research. We have extensive understanding of how our consumers behave, what they like, and that is what gives us the cue to tweak our products and change our offerings. Resilience, again, a very, very important ingredient for success in Africa. Again, our involvement with the infrastructure project is a classic example of resilience. Long years of hard work, not backing off in the face of problems is something which ultimately led to the success of our infrastructure business. And lastly, I would say decentralized and empowerment. We do not work on a command and control manner. A lot of decision making is decentralized, and people are on the ground, are empowered to react to the evolving situation, because in Africa, you need to react to how things are happening, and that cannot be done if decisions are made at the head office. So that captures the learning which we have from our 40 years of experience of operating primarily in Nigeria, but in the last 5 to 10 years, also looking at markets like Egypt, South Africa, Ghana. And on that note, I'd like to thank once again to Johan and UAE for giving me this opportunity and showcase Tolaram to all of you.
Naveen, thank you so much for a very insightful talk on Tolaram and its positioning in Africa, Nigeria specifically. I definitely am going to have a few questions for you during the Q&A session. I would just like to ask the audience, please do not forget you are more than welcome to send any questions that you have via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So please do not hesitate. It is then my privilege to introduce to you Mashume Lam, who is the Managing Director of Poultry East Africa Limited. On the flyer, you would have seen her CV. She started this business and investigations in 2012, and it's today the largest commercial poultry farm in Rwanda. It is a story that is extremely interesting to hear. Shumay, you're currently muted. If you can bring your slides, your screen and your slideshow on board, we look forward to hearing more about Poultry East Africa from you. Over to you.
Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Shumay Lam, and I'm the founder and managing director of Poultry East Africa Limited, which is the largest commercial, fully integrated poultry farm in Rwanda. Our business spans across the value chain. So we start from parent stock all the way down to distribution of eggs, meat, and also day-old chicks. So I'll start my slide. So yeah, that's basically Africa. And if you don't know, Rwanda's right in the middle. It's sort of wedged between Uganda, Tanzania, DRC, Burundi. It's a very tiny nation. It's population about 11 million. And as you can see, it is quite severely landlocked. So it actually does take 3 days of continuous trucking to get from the nearest seaport, either Mombasa or Dar es Salaam, to Rwanda. And there's no current railway that connects them to the port, but that's a work in progress. So I guess the first question would be, out of all these nations, why did I pick Rwanda? And I guess the journey started with this guy here, who was my father. He had a business that was focused on port operations. So similar to what Tolaram's doing, but on a much smaller scale. So the business actually focused a lot on small to medium sized and feeder terminals, which are basically not the big ports, but what you call transshipment ports, where whatever comes from the big ports would then be feeded down to the smaller terminals. So the company was built, and the company was really focused more on frontier markets. So prior to exiting the business, we had about 10 ports. We operated 10 ports around the world. We started in Indonesia, and we had 2 in Gabon, 1 in Algeria, 1 in Malta. And finally, the last acquisition was actually privatizing Majewa, which is the dry port in Rwanda. And that's how I ended up there. So after the sale of the business, which was a listed company on the Singapore Stock Exchange in about 2010-11, my dad wanted to give back to the communities that had supported his business. So logically, out of all these countries that he had operated in, he said that Rwanda would be the best place. And logically, I would be the one to have to set up, his vision. So we actually visited Rwanda for the first time. Well, for me, it was actually my first time in sub-Saharan Africa. So Rwanda was my first country that I visited. And, that was in 2011. And, I fell in love with the place. It's very beautiful. They call it the land of 1,000 hills. It's very scenic. And because he took me there for the launch event of the dry port, I was able to sort of meander around the warehouses. And I realized that everything from toothpaste to powdered coffee, to toilet paper, to used clothes had to be imported because there just weren't any local industries to support the production or the manufacturing. And at that point, it was still very nascent. As you remember, I think, most people would identify Rwanda with the genocide that happened in '94. So it was still very, quite soon after, this catastrophe. And so, we thought, okay, let's find an angle, find a social impact angle that we can invest into the country and assist them in their development. So we went to a restaurant and we had some chicken one day, and we realized that, oh, this chicken is a bit awful. Then we went to the supermarket and we saw the chicken, and it was about 3-5 times the price of what we pay here in Singapore, and arguably the rest of the world, right? Because chicken meat is supposed to be the cheapest meat anywhere in the world because of the quick turnaround time. So we did some further research into why this is, and it's simple supply and demand. There just weren't enough farmers locally. And digging deeper, we realized that the reason for that is because you need scale in order to get the prices down. And when you look at, the more developed countries, especially in the region like Kenya and Uganda, the industries are already a lot more sophisticated, right? They rival sizes of even countries in Southeast Asia. So with that, we decided to go into Rwanda to invest in a poultry farming setup with the objective of providing affordable and accessible meat proteins to a growing population. So very similar to what Toleram's, AAA objectives are. That's what we went in to do. So yeah, so typically chicken is the cheapest meat in the world, right? Because of the quick turnaround time, but it was actually the most expensive meat in Rwanda, to the extent that some people in Rwanda had never actually had chicken in their lives. And the average Rwandan would actually only have it once a year. So instead of having turkey for Christmas, they would have a chicken for Christmas. And these would be the backyard chickens that, have dual purposes, that lay eggs, and then once they're done, you consume them. So supply, demand, and logistics were, obviously key issues. The government had also, been putting out the call to action to help to boost food security and reduce the trade deficit via attracting foreign direct investments and moving away from foreign aid. And obviously everyone loves chicken, right? It's one of the most neutral kind of, religiously neutral kind of meats that you can have unless you're vegetarian, of course. So yeah, so here's the age-old question, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Some scientists in the UK did very, very long, extensive, and expensive study on this, and they told the results were that actually the chicken came first. I don't actually know what that tells us. It's not very relevant. But for me, what comes first, chicken or the egg? I would say that it's neither. It's actually the feed, right? So when you look at any industry, you have to look at the value chain, right? So this is the value chain of a poultry farm. It's a very simplified version, but it's basically, it starts from the great-grandparent stock. And these are typically genes that you pull, the best genes that you want to get from, attributes that you want to get from a chicken. And you pull them and they're sort of grown in the lab. And then from there, it becomes a grandparent stock. From there, it becomes parent stock, breeder farm. You hatch them, and then they're distributed either to be sold as meat, or once they're of age to lay, then you sell the eggs. And then there's processing. But the feed mill is where it all starts, because basically you are what you eat, right? And when we tasted the chicken in Rwanda for the first time, we realized that it tasted a lot like fish. And the reason for that was because the farmers were substituting a lot of the ingredients with fish meal. And the reason for this is also because of the lack of availability of proper raw materials in the region. Rwanda being such a small country, it's very difficult to get a hold of good quality maize and soy. So a lot of it actually had to be imported or grown on a much smaller scale with cooperatives. So initially we thought, okay, what's so difficult about setting up a chicken farm, right? But then we realized that you actually need the entire value chain, otherwise you won't be able to operate. So in 2011, we started the feasibility studies. I identified a few mentors. We decided on the value chain, and we decided, okay, from a very basic perspective, we would definitely need a feed mill and a processing plant to support our broiler farm. But of course, with the processing, you also have to think about distribution, right? Because chicken meat is it's a chilled product or a frozen product. So you also have to look at getting the cold chain set up. In 2012, we registered the company. It did take 6 hours to register a company. You can very easily do it online via the Rwanda Development Board's website. The land acquisition process was the most tedious one. It took about 1.5 years. The reason for that is because most farmers in the rural areas only own about a hectare of land. And we set out to acquire 24 hectares of land. So we actually have to deal with about 24 farmers, but not just that, their entire families. And it's not very easy explaining to farmers the process and how, when you say you have to be here on Saturday to sign over the land, with the entire family, because that's the regulation in Rwanda, they would, come up with different excuses of why they weren't able to make it. So that's the reason why that took so long. So we had to order import equipment. Also because of the landlocked situation, and the congestions in the ports, it took a long time. The construction was about 8 months, and at the end of 2014, we actually launched our full operations. The moment we launched, we were already the largest farm in Rwanda because, like I said, there were just no commercial size farms. So as a result of which the price adjustment was immediately implemented. And along the way, 2016, we began our contract farming project. And 2018, we went up the value chain in terms of hatchery and also our own parent stock farm. So these are our current operations. We work with 30 contract farmers in the district, and with the capacity of producing about 2,000 chickens, 20,000 chickens a week. We have a 400 bird per hour semi-automated processing plant. We have the cold chain, sales and distribution, hatchery, and all that. So these may seem like, oh, we've got a lot going on here, but it's actually very, very small compared to the region. They're way more advanced. They're about 100 times our size. So when you look at these figures, we're still very early on in our process. So this is our feed mill. It's a semi-automated mill. These are our processing plant, our cold chain distribution. So in terms of social impact, like I said, we were actually able to reduce the price of meat by more than 40% in US dollar terms. We employ at any one point of time more than 100 full-time staff, and 95% of them are located from the local village. So we're actually located about 45 minutes away from Kigali, the capital. And prior to us being there, as you saw the first picture with my father walking in the field, that was actually what most of the village was like. So every time I go back, and probably every 3 months, you see, rows and rows of shops being created, because in doing even a small project like this, you basically are creating a local economy, right? So with our 30 contract farmers, they're mostly women. So we're also located close by to a military barrack. So the wives, they've got a small plot of land. As you can see, the infrastructure is quite basic, right? All you need is, a mud hut. If you can afford to have wood, you can, or even, finding whatever bits of material that you can get, and putting together, this environment that's conducive to rearing chickens. So a lot of these stories are very heartfelt, because, a lot of these women started from maybe 400 chickens, and now they've grown by tenfold, right? And it's also nice, as you can see, they tend to have quite a few children as well. So being able to actually continuously send them to school and support their families in addition to the husband's income is always a nice story. So what are the challenges? I would say everything, right? Obviously, when I first started, it's quite a while ago. I was quite young. I had actually just graduated from, not so long ago, graduated from business school. And I had tried to use my the templates that I learned there and impose it on, a country that it's so nascent in its development. And obviously you face a lot of challenges, because you can build the most sophisticated business model until the cows come home, but when it actually comes to implementation, you don't factor in for that. It will probably take you twice as long and cost you twice as much to set things up. Infrastructure, that's a huge thing, right? Like Dr. Sasi had emphasized, it's double landlocked, right? It takes a long time for even a container. And as a result of that, so for example, you order a 40-foot container from China, the cost of the sea freight is about maybe today $3,000-4,000, but the cost of the inland freight from the port to Kigali is $5,000. So you better make sure what you're ordering is actually worth more than the cost of the shipment, right? And obviously it takes months and months to get there. But other than that, the infrastructure is actually pretty good in the city, and also in the means of connecting districts to districts, because they had invested very heavily in building proper roads and highways. And also, I think it's no surprise that Singapore is looking to be the, the shining star. I mean, Rwanda is looking to be the shining star of Africa, or the Singapore of Africa. So what also is very surprising when you go there is how clean it is, and how organized it is. So the other challenges are obviously cost, right? So this was a 100% greenfield project. We couldn't just acquire an existing farm because they didn't exist. Import duties are pretty high. They typically about 25%, and VAT is about 18%. But with agriculture, there's typically a waiver on both import and VAT. So biosecurity, virus, and lack of diagnosis, right? Obviously when you're running a farm, biosecurity is the most important thing, because any outbreak of avian influenza will not only cripple your farm, but can cripple the entire poultry economy. So the inconsistency of inputs for feed is also a huge problem. So a lot of the feed is actually imported from the neighboring countries, but at obviously a higher cost, and obviously at a lower grade. Spending power does remain very, very low, especially in the rural areas. And yeah, there's always threats of new competitors. And the reason for this is because when the market is so small, and even a farmer comes in with, say, 10,000 chickens, and everybody places at once, the price volatility does this, right? So everyone will place at once, the price will plummet, everyone loses money. And then once they start finding money again, everyone rushes in at the same time. So, you can actually get like a 50% peak and trough kind of volatility in prices. Okay, that's about it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Shumay. Thank you so much. That was very interesting and very insightful. Much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to have with us this morning our Vice Dean of the College of Business and Economics, Professor Timu Kautonen, who is an expert in entrepreneurship and also quite interested in competitiveness and in Africa as well. So welcome on board, Professor Timu. We now have the floor open for questions. I originally thought we would be ending at about 10:20. With your permission, we will go through to about 10 past, or rather 10:30. In UAE time. Please, if you need to go, we apologize for running over our time. Professor Timu, do you have any specific questions that you would like to ask any of the panel members whilst we wait for questions from the attending guests? Sasi, can you get on board? I think if you can get time-wise. Prof, while you're looking at that, I will start on my side.
Yes.
We can hear you. There we hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, now it works. Yeah, the thing that I was thinking about with this seminar is that how can we promote and improve the image of Africa towards basically the countries that have the money, so towards Europe, because the image of Africa in Europe is stereotypical. And so when Europeans think about Africa, it's dictatorships, it's famish, it's all of those things, which are not true. And so what can we do in order to improve the image of Africa to be what it actually is? Nice people, people who work hard, resources, incredible resources. So what are we doing in terms of marketing? That's
great. Thank you, Prof. Timu. Gentlemen, any lady, Shumay, gentlemen, any one of you would like to take that on? How do we project Africa in a more favorable light to reflect actually what Africa is about, instead of the stereotypical view of a continent? You know, if you go back, way back, you had this continent of bloodshed and revolution and civil war. And then you have a rising Africa 10, 15 years later. Not enough is being done. And unfortunately, if you look at currently countries such as Ethiopia, Somalia, Mozambique, reaching the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And yet you guys are doing excellent business, Naveen, Shumay, and you're not the only ones. I think about Olam, I think about Walmart, I think about Indorama, Kellogg, not even talking about the motor vehicle manufacturing companies that are all over the continent and that are targeting the continent. How do we improve this positioning of Africa as then this continent of opportunity instead of a continent of doom? Naveen, I'm going to throw the ball at you directly. You've been, Tolaram has been in Africa for decades, century plus.
Yeah. So, Professor John, our view is that, yes, the proof of the pudding is in eating. And the best way to actually get people to change their view about Africa is to bring them there and showcase that. Something which we as a group has been doing very actively. You know, Johan, that Harish was supposed to, you know, be participating in this particular webinar. He's Honorary Consul of Singapore to Africa. And in his role, he has been instrumental in bringing and encouraging people to Nigeria, Ghana, West Africa, to just show them around that, you know, this is a place where you can actually come and do business. As a group, in our own way, as I said, we are developing a free zone. So it's in our economic interest to actually market Africa and Nigeria. And in doing that marketing, we are essentially now using a lot of international agencies to reach out to potential investors, decision makers who decides on where to invest, to showcase them what Africa has to offer, what Nigeria in particular has to offer. But yes, I would agree with Professor Timu that this is a badly marketed continent in general, and a country, especially Nigeria, is a badly marketed country. And unfortunately, the political leadership in most of these countries are not really making the right efforts. But again, I think the best way is to actually bring in people like we have done, even on the side of, you know, bringing in multinationals like Kellogg's, Colgate, Kimberly-Clark, Arla Foods. These are all multinationals who were not even in Africa. Kellogg's first venture foray in Africa was in partnership with us in Nigeria. And since then, Kellogg and our joint venture has now set up factories in Eswatini, in Egypt. We are in the process of setting up a factory in Kenya. So Kellogg leadership has now seen the potential of it. So I think the best way is, again, you know, bring in the people, show them around. Once they realize what the reality is, I think it's the economic interest which will take the driving seat.
While I have you to abuse, I think, Sasi, you have a question, you have a point to make, please?
Well, I just want to jump in and say, I think greenfield FDI coming from, you know, folks like you are actually a positive signal that reinforces the the tourism industry for people who know that, you know, Singapore is heavily invested, and if I live in Singapore and I know a lot of traffic goes into Singapore from whether the perspective of business tourism or whether it is from the perspective of personal tourism dependent economies in Africa, obviously can use this as a statement, as a signal to the rest of the world, saying that, you know, we are not isolated, you know, stuck in older civilization. We are moving on, marching with the times, and this is a statement. I think that's another viable mechanism to change the opinion, and I guess also more dedicated research to bring out these issues probably would and dissemination. No, that's my plug. So, yeah.
Well, if I can complement that, add to that, in terms of countries that are and have been targeting Africa, The US, obviously, China has been a lot involved in Africa, probably by far the largest investor and trader with Africa. You have India, you have Japan, you have now Russia, all very keen to get involved. This is in addition to countries also like Brazil. And I mentioned in the beginning that the UAE is now, for a couple of years, one of the largest FDI investors in Africa. So it does seem that the situation is improving. Naveen, if I can get back to you, you mentioned Kellogg getting involved with you with Multipro. They bought 50%, I think it was 2015, of Multipro for something like its open knowledge in the newspaper, 450 million. Multipro is a distribution company for all practical purposes. So this is a strong message about Kellogg's view, A, of the potential of Nigeria, and B, their trust in Tolerant. Thereafter, you have now created a pasta factory in Egypt. If you have a look at Egypt, they are literally 8th on the global competitiveness rankings. And if you look at the ease of doing business rankings, they are 13th, more or less 13th, 14th in Africa. So it's not the most, from that perspective, glamorous. Why Egypt? For your first factory. And then you went to Eswatini, which is off the chart and everything for that matter.
Okay,
please.
Yeah, so two different ventures have two different reasons altogether. Again, I think I mentioned this right at the beginning of my presentation that, you know, what Dr. Sashi shared was enlightening, but not necessarily something which the business practitioners use in their decision making. So we are in the business of noodles. That's our mainstay. That's our number one product. What we have realized that for our kind of product, what we look for is urban concentration of population with high women participation in workforce. So when we looked at a plan of how to expand in the rest of Africa, once we decided that we want to go abroad, go beyond Nigeria and Ghana, we looked at the urban centers. And from that point of view, then, you know, the logical list of places to go were Cairo, Durban, Kampala. So these are some of the places, even Casablanca in Morocco. And then again, I think when we looked at Egypt, we also looked at the potential of other major urban centers in and around Cairo. So I think that was the driving force for us. We went into Eswatini as a location which is more suitable from the point of view of manufacturing if you want to serve the South African market. We first went into South Africa, we got into a contract manufacturing, and we soon ran into labor problems. And that's when I think our past experience of running some businesses in South Africa out of Eswatini helped. So we then decided to set up our manufacturing facility in Eswatini, because Eswatini has that open trade relationship with South Africa. So it allows us to serve the South African market without having to deal with the trouble of labor force within South Africa, which is far more militant than how it is in Eswatini. So I think, I hope I've answered your questions.
Indeed you have. Thank you for that. And I'm glad to hear that you're now moving into Kenya as well, because Kenya kind of forms the hub in East Africa. So you would have a presence in West, North, East, and Southern Africa, which then covers all your bases with and very attractive markets as far as that is concerned. Before I ask Shumay, I would like to ask Dr. Sasi, you mentioned about the fact that there was a reference that GDP is not the only function and the only factor that you do look at. And Naveen has indicated a few issues. GDP per capita, size of population, together with GDP. Would you agree that those become important elements? Because, you know, if you're sitting with a very competitive country and very easy to do business in, but there's no real substantial market, are you interested in going in there? And maybe Naveen can give his perspective also, but from your view as an expert on the issue of competitiveness, I would be more eager to go into a country that is lower on the rankings of competitiveness and ease of doing business, as long as there's a sizable market with a lot of spending power, than I would be to go into a a country where you don't have a large market, but a very competitive, albeit very small, and very easy to do business, albeit very small. The contrast, how do I deal with this? And Naveen, if you can just bear that in mind as well.
Sure.
Actually, I think Naveen should answer that. I think you've covered it pretty well. The way you've summarized it was quite a nice formulation. I think that would have been my answer too. You need to be looking at market size, and I think it's a very important aspect of your metric, and you cannot ignore that. And purchasing power is absolutely important. And if you are going to venture into a country with very low purchasing power and where there is no potential and there is a market size, and obviously you're going to be thinking twice before undertaking the investment, unless you love taking risks and you don't mind gambling your bets because you have you think there is a good chance. So that is absolute, and that is being taken care of in most of these indicators. Typically, they pay specific attention to the idea of size, and without adjustments, it doesn't make sense to compare very small countries with very large countries. And so you need to really have that at the back of your mind when you are computing these indicators. And I'm actually also interested in, very briefly hearing from Naveen about what really then matters. You said these indicators are useless, which is actually great to know from an academic point of view, because I always, this is what I tell people, when actually people do real businesses, they don't really care about your work. And this is really not the indicator they use, but then they have your own internal metrics. But then how different are they from, I'm not trying to ask you more questions and I'm running out of time, but more like whether those metrics are substantially different when you mention something like the market potential, which is something that I can understand. But then how different is it when you define the way you define market potential from what other traditional indices would look like? If I may just add that.
So there are different facets to this question, and maybe I think at some point I'll also request Swimi to jump into it, because
Naveen, can I ask you to summarize that for me in a minute and a half, because we're running out of time.
Sure. So essentially, if you're entrepreneurial, you go with your gut. That's what they did. And that's what my chairman did when he went into Africa. But again, coming back to just the point about the purchasing power, again, this is misnomer. It also has to be related to the kind of product you are trying to sell. Yeah, a consumer goods product like noodles, which is targeted to the category C, D, E of the population, we actually would thrive better in places where people don't have very high purchasing power. So what we do, we are competing against the bread and rice and other staple, and that's what our competition is, where high ratio of your outlay goes towards food. So again, I think each company would look at these things in greater detail. Yes, competitive indexes are not useless, and I never use that word, Dr. Sashi, and in fact, in the context of free zone, I see the importance of these, especially from a policy formulation, because when we work with the government in terms of trying to create the right policy in the free zone, we go and talk to them on the basis of these. We tell them these are the areas you help us to improve this so that we can bring in FDI into the country. So I definitely feel that it's always about each specific case and the clear context in which these informations and these data points have to be used. It's not universal. And on that note, maybe Sumi, if you would like to add to this particular conversation.
Please, Shumai. Because I was going to ask you the question related to that. You chose Rwanda, 12 million people, $10 billion economy. There's not a lot of chicken, and I think that's the point that links up with what Naveen said. But you could have gone into Kenya, you could have gone into Tanzania, two countries with vastly larger populations as well as GDPs. Other than having a love for Rwanda, was there any other reason as an entrepreneur that drove the decision to go into Rwanda?
Well, I suppose, even leading back to when my dad was still around and he was doing business, he was always looking to be the bigger fish in a small pond, right? And our philosophy is, you start small and you scale up from there. Obviously, the barriers to entry in more developed countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, be a lot higher. The initial startup costs as well be a lot higher, right? Because you will need to go in at a larger scale than the biggest player in order to really make a dent or even be competitive. So for us, obviously Rwanda was a low-hanging fruit because we already had existing relations with the government, and also accessibility with the Rwanda Development Board and their assistance in this project. It's not many countries in the world that you can just pick up a phone and call a minister and say, yo, can you help me out here? You know what I mean? So yeah, I guess it was a lot more, it was a fun adventure, and also, a lot more informal in the processes and protocols that exist in Rwanda to get us to where we are today.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Gentlemen, lady, anything that any of you in conclusion would like to say in terms of your foray, your entry into Africa, before I conclude the session? Sasi, any last words from you?
No, it will be great at some point to know more about the provincial differences in these large countries that they are trying to enter into, because that seems like a big, big issue in most large emerging markets and developing economies. And so it makes, it'll be enlightening to know more about the provincial differences at some point.
Naveen?
Yeah. Well, I think I would say that Africa is an exciting place if you're willing to explore and take a bit of a risk, then there is a lot to gain from it. So yes, broad studies gives you a sense of where things are in general, but like, we've shared some of our experience. It's the context of what you're trying to do and where you're trying to do that is more important. And that is something you will be able to ascertain only when you get down on the ground and understand it for yourself.
Great, I agree. Thank you. Shumay, last words from you?
Well, looking at Africa or investing in Africa is definitely a long-term play. You don't go in and expect to cash out quickly unless you look at mining or specific industries. But in saying that as well, you need to be passionate about the continent, right? Because each country has its own different quirks, and if you're not passionate about it, then you wouldn't have the mettle to be able to last for the long term.
Indeed. Shumay, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and willingness to contribute to our STEPS forum. Africa is very close to my heart as a South African, and looking at the competitiveness thereof, I think is extremely important in the day and age of today, where we looking at places where there are still investment opportunities. And I think what we heard today, that yes, there are risks involved. It's not always portrayed in the best possible way, but if you understand the risk, you've done your homework, that Africa is definitely a place where there are a lot of returns to be generated, both for large corporates and for entrepreneurs. I personally have done a lot of research on the issue of the circular economy, sustainability, looking at manufacturing, renewable energy. It is fascinating, the opportunities that are available. Motor vehicle manufacturing, I mentioned in the beginning, the large global manufacturers are streaming into Africa at the same time that we are finding that local economies are developing local brands in this industry as well. Textiles, you mentioned it, it is a broad range of opportunities. So on this note, thank you so much. It has been very insightful to listen to you on being experts in your respective fields. On behalf of the UAEU and the College of Business and Economics, my heartfelt thanks and appreciation. And hopefully I can tap at some point in time in the future, tap into your expert knowledge again. So all the best, have a great weekend, and enjoy the rest of your day. Keep well.
Thank you. Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.